Imagine a world where the sun dictates your clock and the horizon is your only screen. There are no notifications, no background hum of a refrigerator, and no glowing glass rectangles to numb the mind. When the chores are finished and the tools are put away, you are left with the one thing modern humans fear most: total, unyielding silence. How did our ancestors survive the void without losing their minds? They didn't just kill time, they wove it into an art form. This is the story of how humanity thrived in the quiet before the noise. For the modern American, free time is a vacuum that must be filled immediately. We reach for our phones before we've even fully processed a moment of stillness. But for a family living on the edge of the frontier in the 18th or 19th century, or even a villager in medieval Europe, time was not something to be spent, it was something to be endured. The first thing you would notice stepping back into a world without electronic entertainment is the sheer physical weight of the silence. In the absence of podcasts, music streaming, or television, the human ear becomes hyper-attuned to the environment. Without the white noise of the industrial age, a creaking floorboard or the distant howl of a wolf wasn't just a sound, it was an event. People passed time by listening. They learned to read the wind and the subtle shifts in the forest's cadence. This wasn't a choice made for mindfulness, it was a survival mechanism that doubled as a way to occupy the mind. When the sun went down, the world shrank to the size of a candle's glow. This is where the psychology of doing nothing truly began. In a typical colonial American home, the evening hours were dictated by the cost of light. Candles were expensive and labor-intensive to make. Consequently, many families spent their evenings in the gloaming, that twilight hour where it is too dark to work but too early to sleep. During these hours, the mind had to travel inward. People became chroniclers of their own thoughts. They sat in the dark and spoke. They didn't need a topic of conversation because the conversation was the lifeblood of the house. They recounted the events of the day in grueling detail, not because the events were exciting, but because the act of storytelling gave the day a structure. A simple trip to a neighbor's house to borrow a tool would be recounted with the narrative complexity of an epic poem. This era also saw the rise of the internal theater. Without external visuals, the human imagination was far more muscular than it is today. When a grandfather told a ghost story by the hearth, the children didn't just listen, they projected those images onto the dancing shadows on the wall. The lack of entertainment forced the brain to become its own content creator. Boredom acted as a pressure cooker for creativity. If you wanted to see something beautiful, you had to carve it out of wood or stitch it into a quilt. If you wanted to hear music, you had to learn to whistle, sing, or play a battered fiddle. The entertainment was the byproduct of effort, and that effort consumed the hours that would otherwise be lost to the crushing weight of the silence. In the modern world, we draw a hard line between work and fun. Work is what we do to earn a living, and entertainment is the reward we consume afterward. However, for those living in the pre-industrial era, this distinction barely existed. To survive the monotony of a world without digital distractions, humanity perfected the art of the work bee. They realized early on that if you have to perform a grueling, repetitive task for 10 hours, the only way to prevent the mind from collapsing under the weight of boredom is to turn the labor itself into a social event. Imagine an autumn evening in the early American Midwest. The harvest is in, but the work is far from over. Thousands of ears of corn sit in massive piles, needing to be husked before they rot. To a single family, this is a month of soul-crushing, finger-bleeding toil. But to a community, it is the social event of the season, the husking bee. Neighbors would travel for miles, not because they were paid, but because the event itself was the entertainment. They would gather in a barn lit by lanterns, the air thick with the smell of dried earth and hay. The husking was the background noise to a competitive, high-stakes social game. Stories were traded like currency.
In these circles, the person who could tell the best joke or hold the longest narrative thread was the influencer of their day. They weren't just husking corn, they were performing. To keep the momentum alive, they invented games within the work. A famous tradition across rural America was the red ear of corn. If a young man husked an ear with red kernels, he won the right to kiss any girl in the barn. It sounds quaint now, but in a world with no dating apps and limited social mixing, this was a moment of high-voltage adrenaline. It turned a chore into a theater of romance and rivalry. The hands moved automatically, fueled by the rhythm of gossip and song, making the time vanish in a way that staring at a screen never could. Women's circles operated with a similar brilliance. Quilting wasn't just about making blankets, it was a physical map of the community's history. As 6 or 8 women sat around a wooden frame, their needles moving in a synchronized dance, they were engaged in deep play. They would discuss the nuances of a local marriage, the health of a distant relative, or the contents of a letter received from back east. Because their hands were busy, their minds were free to wander. This state of flow, where the body is occupied but the brain is engaged socially, was the primary defense against the isolation of the wilderness. This era taught us that passing time was most effective when it was productive. There was a profound psychological satisfaction in looking at a pile of finished quilts or a bin of husked corn at the end of the night. The entertainment wasn't something you watched, it was something you felt in your tired muscles and heard in the echoes of the laughter shared with neighbors. They didn't have hobbies in the modern sense, they had communal necessities that they dressed up in the clothes of a party. By the time the lanterns flickered out, the void of the quiet night had been defeated by the collective energy of the tribe.
In a world without the written word for many, or the glowing screen for all, the storyteller was the ultimate technology. Today, we consume stories passively, but in the centuries preceding the digital age, a story was a living, breathing entity that required a partnership between the teller and the listener. To pass the time during long, dark winters or endless sea voyages, people didn't just tell stories, they built entire universes out of nothing but breath and imagination. In the American Appalachian Mountains or the remote fishing villages of the North Atlantic, the tall tale became a primary defense against the monotony of isolation. When the chores were done and the fire was the only source of light, the community would look to the elders or the most charismatic among them. These individuals were the human Netflix of their era. They possessed an incredible mental library of folklore, genealogy, and local legend. But more importantly, they understood the pacing of human attention. A master storyteller knew how to stretch a 5-minute event into a 2-hour epic. They used the suspense of the mundane. They would describe the way a shadow moved across a cabin wall, or the specific whistle of a wind through a pine forest with such evocative detail that the listeners would lose the sense of their physical surroundings. This was a form of collective hypnosis. In the absence of special effects, the storyteller used vocal modulation, long pauses, and dramatic gestures to create a high-definition experience in the minds of the audience. This oral tradition served a deeper purpose than mere distraction. It was how history was preserved. Because there were no documentaries to watch, people passed time by memorizing their lineage and the stories of their ancestors. A young person might spend hours listening to an aunt recount the journey of their great-grandparents across the ocean. These weren't dry facts, they were narrated with the emotional weight of a modern prestige drama. By participating in this, the listeners felt connected to a timeline much larger than their own small, quiet lives. For the youth, this was also the era of the riddle and the ballad. Riddles were the mental puzzles of the day, a way to sharpen the wit when there were no crosswords or Sudoku. A group of people might spend an entire evening trying to solve a single, complex metaphorical puzzle posed by a visitor. Ballads, on the other hand, were stories set to simple melodies. Since there were no recordings, if you wanted to hear your favorite song, you had to sing it. Songs often had 30 or 40 verses, acting as rhythmic newspapers that told of shipwrecks, murders, or heroic deeds in distant lands. The brilliance of the oral tradition was its interactivity. An audience wouldn't just sit in silence, they would gasp, groan, laugh, and interrupt with questions. The story changed based on the energy of the room. This wasn't a one-way stream of content, it was a communal bridge built across the empty hours. When the story finally ended and the last ember of the fire died down, the silence of the room didn't feel empty anymore. It was filled with the ghosts and heroes the storyteller had summoned. People didn't go to sleep bored. They went to sleep with their minds vibrating with the images they had helped create. In the 21st century, a text message is a disposable thought, sent in a second and forgotten in two. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, the written word was the most powerful form of time travel and emotional survival available to the human race. For people living in the vast, expanding territories of the United States, or for those separated by the Atlantic Ocean, a letter was not just correspondence, it was a lifeline. Writing and reading letters became one of the most significant ways people occupied their solitary hours, turning a simple task into a ritual of deep reflection. When you have no telephone to call a loved one, the act of writing becomes an exercise in presence. To pass the time, a person would sit for hours at a small desk or by a window, carefully preparing their tools. This wasn't a quick process. You had to trim a quill, mix the ink, and choose your paper carefully, as postage was often charged by the sheet. This physical preparation slowed the mind down, forcing the writer to enter a state of total focus that we rarely achieve today. The content of these letters was vastly different from modern communication. Because a letter might take weeks or even months to arrive, you couldn't just talk about the weather. Instead, people wrote journal letters. They would record their inner thoughts, their spiritual struggles, and their observations of the natural world in exquisite long-form prose. They weren't just passing time, they were archiving their souls. A single letter could take 3 nights to complete, written in installments after the children were in bed. This process allowed people to process their own lives, transforming the boredom of a lonely farmhouse into a structured narrative. The arrival of the mail was perhaps the most high-octane entertainment of the era. In small American frontier towns, the day the post rider or the stagecoach arrived was a day of electric tension. The entire town would gather, waiting as the names were called out. Receiving a letter was like a modern season finale of a favorite show. You didn't just read it once, you performed a slow burn of consumption. A recipient would often retreat to a private spot and read the letter over and over, analyzing every word, every curve of the handwriting, and even the scent of the paper. To make the entertainment last, letters were often shared. A father would read a letter from a distant son aloud to the whole family by the hearth. It would be discussed for days afterward. Why did he use that word? What did he mean by that pause in the story? The letter became a script for a communal experience. In many ways, the lack of instant communication made the delayed communication far more valuable. The long wait created a psychological buildup that made the eventual payoff, the reading of the letter, intensely satisfying. Furthermore, for those who were literate, letter writing was a way to practice the art of the self. Without a camera to take a selfie, you had to describe yourself. You had to use words to paint a picture of how you had changed, how the sun had tanned your skin, or how the winter had leaned heavy on your spirits.
This deep introspection occupied the mind for hours, turning the vacuum of free time into a rich internal dialogue. People were never truly alone as long as they had a pen, a scrap of paper, and the hope of a reply somewhere out on the horizon.
In the centuries before the internet, if you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you couldn't scroll through a feed. You had to physically move your body to a specific location. In early America and Europe, the local tavern or the town square wasn't just a place to get a drink or buy grain. It was the central processing unit of society. It was the only place where the great silence of the rural landscape was broken by a cacophony of voices, making it the most vital form of entertainment available. For a farmer who spent 6 days a week speaking only to his oxen or his immediate family, the trip to the tavern was an explosion of sensory input. Taverns were intentionally designed to be loud, crowded, and warm. They were the original multimedia hubs. As soon as you stepped through the door, you were hit with a wall of information. Travelers from distant cities would be surrounded like celebrities, asked to recount news of politics, wars, or even fashion trends from the coast. This was live news in its rawest form. People would sit for hours nursing a single mug of ale just to listen to the debates unfolding at the next table. The entertainment here was the art of the argument. Without the echo chambers of social media, people with vastly different viewpoints were forced to sit face to face. A local blacksmith might find himself debating theology with a traveling preacher or land rights with a wealthy merchant. These debates were often highly performative. The crowd would gather around, cheering for a well-placed verbal jab or groaning at a weak point. It was a spectator sport of the mind. To pass the time, people sharpened their wits, learning how to use rhetoric and logic to win the room. Outside, in the town square, the entertainment was more chaotic and physical. This was the era of the public notice. Since newspapers were rare and expensive, the town crier or a posted broadside was the primary source of information. People would gather around the courthouse steps to hear proclamations read aloud, but they stayed for the human drama. The town square was a theater of the mundane, watching the militia drill on the green, observing the public shaming of a local criminal in the stocks, or witnessing a heated auction. These events provided the content that people would discuss for the next month. Games also played a massive role in these communal spaces. In the absence of sports broadcasts, people played participation sports. In an American tavern, you might find a group huddled over a game of nine men's Morris or backgammon. In the town square, men would compete in tests of strength, wrestling, stone throwing, or rough and tumble matches. There was no watching from a couch. You were either a participant or a vocal critic on the sidelines. The stakes were high because your reputation in the community was built on these small public moments. The beauty of the tavern and the square was that they turned waiting into an event. You might go to town to wait for a blacksmith to fix a plow, but that wait became 4 hours of political debate, a game of cards, and 3 new stories to tell your family. These spaces proved that humans don't actually need content to be entertained. They need connection. The tavern was the place where the individual's quiet life merged with the collective roar of the world, making the long, lonely hours of the coming week feel a little more bearable. Before the era of weather apps and high-definition nature documentaries, the sky was the most watched screen in existence. For the modern person, a sunset is a pretty background for a photo. For someone in the 17th or 18th century, the sky was a complex, shifting narrative that dictated their survival, their mood, and their sense of time. When there was no electricity to push back the dark, the celestial bodies and the changing atmosphere became a primary source of intellectual and visual engagement. People passed countless hours practicing the art of sky reading. This wasn't just about predicting rain, it was a deep, meditative observation.
An old farmer or a sailor could sit for an hour watching the way a particular bank of clouds moved against the horizon, interpreting the colors and textures with the precision of a scientist. They knew that a mackerel sky, clouds that looked like fish scales, meant that a change in weather was coming within 24 hours. This constant engagement with the environment meant that one was never truly bored because the world was always sending signals that needed to be decoded. The arrival of the night sky brought a different kind of entertainment, the great celestial map. Without light pollution, the Milky Way didn't just look like a faint smudge. It was a brilliant silver river that dominated the consciousness. For a family sitting on a porch in the American frontier, the stars were their mythology. They didn't just see dots of light, they saw the stories of heroes, animals, and gods that had been passed down for generations. Parents would point out the constellations to their children, weaving the movement of the stars into the moral fabric of their lives. The stars provided a sense of cosmic theater that made their small, quiet lives feel connected to the infinite. The change of seasons provided the seasonal premieres of the era, the first frost, the arrival of the first robin, or the specific way the light hit the trees in late October were events to be celebrated and discussed. People would spend hours walking through the woods or sitting by a stream, simply observing the micro changes in the landscape. This heightened state of awareness meant that the entertainment was found in the details, the patterns of ice on a window pane, the migration patterns of birds, or the blooming of a rare wildflower. These weren't just sights, they were the markers of time passing. In winter, when the world was trapped in a monochromatic white, the theater moved to the windows. The way the snow drifted against the barn, or the way the wind sculpted the landscape became the visual interest of the day. This forced people into a state of slow observation. When you cannot change the channel, you learn to see the beauty in the slight variations of what is already there. You learn that a single tree, seen every day for 20 years, has 1,000 different stories to tell, depending on the light. This connection to the natural world provided a psychological grounding that modern entertainment often strips away. By focusing on the sky and the earth, people felt a sense of belonging to the rhythm of the universe. They didn't need a fast-paced plot or a digital explosion to keep their attention. The slow, inevitable movement of a shadow across a field, or the rising of a blood moon, was enough to fill an entire evening with wonder. They lived in a world where nature was the lead actor, and they were the most attentive audience. If you were to walk into a common room in an 18th century New England home, or a pioneer cabin on the edge of the Oregon Trail, you would notice a curious thing. No one's hands were ever still. In the modern age, we consider doing nothing to be a state of total physical relaxation. But to our ancestors, doing nothing was a dangerous invitation to melancholy and restlessness. To pass the time, they engaged in what we might call productive meditation, the repetitive, rhythmic arts of whittling and needlework. For the men, the pocket knife was the ultimate tool of distraction. Whittling wasn't just a way to make a spoon, it was a psychological anchor. A man might sit on a porch for 3 hours, seemingly staring into space, but his hands would be busy transforming a scrap of cedar into a chain, a small bird, or a toy for a child. This was the fidget spinner of the pre-industrial world, but with a far deeper purpose. The tactile sensation of wood yielding to a sharp blade provided a sense of control and progress. As the shavings piled up at his feet, the hours didn't just disappear, they were converted into a physical object. This kept the monkey mind at bay, allowing a person to endure long periods of physical stillness without the mental agitation we feel today when our phones die. For women, the needle served the same purpose, but with an even more complex social and emotional layers. Needlework, whether it was darning socks, embroidering a sampler, or lace making, was a grueling test of patience and eyesight. However, it was also a primary form of creative expression in a world that offered few outlets for it. A woman might spend an entire winter's worth of evenings on a single piece of decorative whitework. To a modern observer, this looks like a chore. To her, it was a slow-motion explosion of artistry. Every stitch was a decision, every pattern a puzzle solved. The repetitive motion induced a semi-hypnotic state, a flow that allowed her to travel miles in her mind while her body remained anchored to the hearth. These handcrafts also served as a social lubricant. Because these tasks were semi-automatic, they didn't require full cognitive load. This allowed for a specific kind of conversation, one that was rhythmic and unhurried. People could talk about deep, difficult subjects because they didn't have to maintain constant eye contact. Their eyes were on their work. The work acted as a buffer for the intensity of human interaction. In a world without background music, the snip-snip of scissors or the shave-shave of a knife provided the rhythmic soundtrack to their lives. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this hand entertainment was the puzzle toy. People would pass months of winter evenings creating impossible objects, like a wooden ball inside a carved cage or a ship in a bottle. These weren't made for profit. They were made to defeat the vacuum of time. The more difficult and time-consuming the task, the better. It was a way to challenge the brain, to prove that the human spirit could create something intricate and beautiful out of the most basic materials and the most abundant resource they had: empty hours. When we look at a hand-carved chair or a hand-stitched quilt today, we see folk art. But for the person who made it, it was a shield. It was the thing that stood between them and the crushing weight of a silent afternoon. They didn't just make things to use them. They made things to survive the experience of being alone with their own thoughts. They found the zen in the repetitive motion, proving that the best way to pass the time is to leave a mark on it.
Today, we consume music as a polished digital commodity. We press a button and the world's greatest orchestras or pop stars fill our ears. But for most of human history, if you wanted to hear music, someone in the room had to make it. There was no background music in the 1800s. Music was a foreground event, a physical manifestation of energy that turned a silent house into a theater. To pass the time, families didn't just listen to music, they were the music. In the mid to late 19th century, the piano became the television of the American middle-class home. Owning a piano was the ultimate status symbol, but it was also the primary source of nightly entertainment. Because there were no recordings, people bought sheet music the way we buy movie tickets today. When a new song became a hit in New York or London, it traveled across the country as paper. To find out what the song sounded like, someone had to sit down and play it. This made the act of passing time a skill-based endeavor. Young women and men spent thousands of hours practicing scales and complex pieces, not necessarily because they wanted to be professional musicians, but because being able to play was the only way to bring content into the home. In the mid to late 19th century, the piano became the television of the American middle-class home. Owning a piano was the ultimate status symbol, but it was also the primary source of nightly entertainment. Because there were no recordings, people bought sheet music the way we buy movie tickets today. When a new song became a hit in New York or London, it traveled across the country as paper. To find out what the song sounded like, someone had to sit down and play it. This made the act of passing time a skill-based endeavor. Young women and men spent thousands of hours practicing scales and complex pieces, not necessarily because they wanted to be professional musicians, but because being able to play was the only way to bring content into the home. In the rural or less affluent areas, the music was more visceral and portable. The fiddle, the banjo, and the harmonica were the tools of the trade. On a Saturday night, a farmhouse kitchen would be cleared of its table and chairs, and the barn dance would begin. This wasn't a professional performance, it was a communal explosion. People would spend hours playing the same 4 chords over and over, while the rest of the room stomped their feet, clapped, and sang.
The repetition was the point. It created a trance-like state that washed away the exhaustion of a week spent in the fields. Without a radio to tell them what was cool, communities developed their own unique sounds, regional styles that became the DNA of bluegrass, blues, and folk. The most intimate form of musical time passing, however, was the singing school or the family hymn sing. In the evenings, families would sit together and sing in four-part harmony. They didn't need instruments, they used their voices to build a complex wall of sound. This required intense mental focus and cooperation. You had to listen to your neighbor to stay in tune, creating a deep sense of social synchronization. They would sing rounds, songs like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, which were essentially vocal puzzles designed to keep the mind sharp and the spirit lifted. For the solitary person, music was a way to fill the empty air. A shepherd in the field or a sailor on a watch would whistle or sing to himself for hours. These weren't just idle tunes, they were work songs designed to match the rhythm of their labor. The melody provided a structure to the day, a way to measure the passage of time without a clock. If a task took 3 ballads to finish, the time felt shorter. The beauty of this era was that there was no such thing as a passive listener. If you were in the room, you were part of the performance. You were humming, tapping a spoon, or dancing. Music was a bridge that connected the individual to the group, turning the quiet, dark hours of the evening into a vibrant, living experience. They didn't need a perfect recording. They needed the raw, imperfect, and joyful noise of their own making. In the parlor and the porch, the silence was not just broken, it was transformed into art.
In the modern world, reading is a silent, solitary act. We retreat into our own heads, scrolling through digital books or physical novels in quiet isolation. But in the 19th century, literacy was a hard-won prize, and books were precious, expensive objects. To pass the time, people didn't just read to themselves, they turned literature into a communal performance. This was the era of reading aloud, a practice that turned a single book into a theater for the whole family or community. Imagine a kitchen in a prairie sod house or a drawing room in a coastal city. The chores are done, and the family gathers around the single source of light, usually a kerosene lamp or a cluster of candles. One person, often the one with the clearest voice or the highest education, would take the seat of honor and begin to read. This wasn't a quick scan of the plot, it was a slow, dramatic rendition. They would voice different characters, pause for dramatic effect, and stop to discuss the moral dilemmas presented in the text. A single novel, like a Dickens masterpiece, or a serialized story from a magazine like Harper's Weekly, could provide weeks of nightly entertainment. This communal reading served a vital psychological function. It provided a shared alternate reality. In a world where your physical reality was often limited to a few square miles of farmland, books were the only window into the great elsewhere. By reading aloud, the family traveled together. They walked the streets of London, sailed the South Seas, or debated philosophy in Parisian cafes, all without leaving their hearth. This shared experience created a collective vocabulary. The characters in the book became as real as their neighbors, and their fates were discussed with the same intensity as local gossip. For those who couldn't afford a library of their own, the traveling library and the Lyceum movement became the social networks of the mind. In America, the bookmobile was preceded by circuit riders and traveling preachers who carried books in their saddlebags. When a new shipment of books arrived at a general store or a local post office, it was a cultural event equivalent to a blockbuster movie release. People would walk for miles to borrow a book, and the entertainment began the moment they started the long walk home, anticipating the stories contained within the pages. The Lyceum movement took this even further. These were organized public lectures where people would gather in town halls to hear speakers discuss science, literature, or travel. To pass an evening,
People would sit for 2 or 3 hours listening to a person describe the geography of the Arctic or the mechanics of a steam engine. There were no slides, no videos, just the power of the spoken word. The audience had to use their mental muscles to visualize the descriptions. This was high-level intellectual entertainment that demanded deep focus and rewarded the listener with a sense of expansion. Even for the solitary reader, the lack of content meant that books were read with a level of intensity we can barely imagine today. A person might only own 3 books, usually a Bible, a collection of Shakespeare, and an almanac. They would read these books hundreds of times, memorizing passages and internalizing the language. They didn't consume information, they inhabited it. This slow, deep immersion turned the passage of time into a process of self-building. They weren't just killing an hour, they were decorating the interior of their minds with the finest thoughts humanity had to offer.
In a world where the physical landscape was often unpredictable and chaotic, fraught with storms, failed crops, and the whims of nature, the game board offered something rare, a miniature universe governed by absolute rules. To pass the time in the long, stagnant stretches between seasons, humanity turned to the architecture of play. From the marble halls of Europe to the rough-hewn tables of American saloons, board games were the ultimate mental simulators, providing a high-stakes escape from the boredom of the mundane. In the mid-19th century, before the invention of the mass-market cardboard game, many people crafted their own sets. A game of chess or checkers, known as drafts in much of the world, wasn't just a casual pastime, it was a battle of reputations. Men would spend years playing the same neighbor, their rivalry becoming a legendary subplot in the town's history. Because there were no new games being released every week, players achieved a level of mastery that is rare in our era of infinite variety. They studied the board until the grain of the wood was as familiar as their own skin. This deep focus was a form of meditation, a way to shrink the world down to 64 squares where every move had a consequence. In America, the game of 9 men's Morris was a staple of the frontier. It required nothing more than a board carved into a stump and 18 pebbles or corn kernels. It was a game of closing the mill, a tactical struggle of positioning and capture. People would sit for hours in a semi-silent trance, the only sound being the click of a stone against wood. These games were the original brain trainers. Without digital puzzles, these physical strategy games kept the mind sharp, preventing the mental rot that people feared would come from isolation. They were practicing the skills of life, patience, foresight, and the ability to read an opponent, all while the clock on the wall ticked unnoticed. For the younger generation, the table game was the primary way to learn social etiquette. Games like The Mansion of Happiness, one of the first commercially produced board games in the U.S., weren't just for fun, they were moral instruction. Players moved their pieces through a path of virtues like temperance and justice, and vices like cruelty and idleness. Passing time was thus transformed into a lesson in character. Children would play these games repeatedly, the repetition embedding the rules of society into their minds. It was edutainment in its most primal form, turning a rainy afternoon into a training ground for adulthood. However, the most electric atmosphere was found in the world of cards. While many religious communities viewed cards as the devil's picture books, they were the lifeblood of the tavern and the bunkhouse. Games like whist, a precursor to bridge, required intense cooperation and memory. To play whist well, you had to track every card that had been played, calculating the probabilities of what remained in your opponent's hands. This wasn't mindless fun, it was high-octane mental labor. A single game could last 4 hours, with the tension in the room rising to a fever pitch as the tricks were won or lost. The beauty of these games lay in their portability and their permanence.
A deck of cards or a handful of pebbles could turn a grueling sea voyage, a lonely night in a hunting cabin, or a tense wait in a stagecoach station into a theater of strategy. They proved that humans do not need complex graphics or electronic sounds to be immersed. We only need a challenge, a set of rules, and a worthy opponent. By mastering the board, people mastered the void of time, turning nothing to do into a quest for victory. In our modern, sanitized world, we hide death behind hospital curtains and treat justice as a private administrative process. But for people in the 18th and 19th centuries, the darker side of existence was not something to be avoided. It was a primary source of public fascination. In a time when content was scarce, the high-stakes drama of the courtroom, the somber theater of a funeral, and the grim reality of public punishment were the most gripping shows in town. To pass the time, people didn't look away from the macabre. They leaned into it. The local courthouse was the original true crime podcast. When a high-profile trial took place, the town ground to a halt. People would travel for miles to pack into the gallery, sitting on hard wooden benches for 10 hours a day just to hear the lawyers' closing arguments. These weren't just legal proceedings, they were epic moral battles. Every witness's testimony was analyzed at the dinner table that night as if it were a plot twist in a thriller. Without television dramas, the real-life question of a neighbor's guilt or innocence provided a psychological intensity that filled the empty months of winter. People became amateur historians and legal experts, debating the nuances of intent and character to pass the long hours by the fire. Even more shocking to the modern sensibility was the role of public punishment. Before the mid-19th century, the spectacle of the scaffold was a major communal event. A public hanging or the placement of a person in the stocks wasn't just about deterrence, it was a grim theatrical performance. Thousands would gather, bringing picnics and dressing in their Sunday best. They would listen to the final speech of the condemned, which was often printed and sold as a souvenir broadside. This wasn't because people were inherently more bloodthirsty. It was because, in a world with no digital simulations of violence, the reality of life and death was the most visceral experience available. It was a reminder of the fragility of the social contract, a live-action drama with the highest possible stakes. When death struck closer to home, the mourning rituals of the Victorian era turned grief into a sophisticated, time-consuming art form. Passing the time during a period of mourning was a highly structured process. Women, in particular, were expected to spend months or years following strict rules of dress and behavior. They would create memento mori, intricate jewelry woven from the hair of the deceased, or elaborate mourning quilts. This work was slow, meticulous, and deeply symbolic. It gave the bereaved a job to do, a way to channel their sorrow into a physical craft. The funeral itself was a major social production. In rural communities, a death meant a wake that could last for days. People would sit with the body, telling stories of the deceased, eating together and singing dirges. This wasn't just about respect, it was a way to fill the sudden hollow silence that death leaves behind. By making the rituals of death so long and complex, they ensured that the community remained connected during its most vulnerable moments. This engagement with the macabre allowed people to process their fears collectively. They didn't have horror movies to provide a safe thrill. They had the cemetery, the courtroom, and the town square. By turning the darker aspects of the human condition into a public spectacle, they made sense of a world where life was often short and justice was often harsh. They passed their time by looking directly into the shadows, finding there a strange communal light that helped them value the life they still had.
For a child growing up in a quiet, dusty town in the 1800s, the world was a predictable shade of brown, green, and gray. You knew every face in your village.
the sound of every neighbor's gate, and the exact rhythm of the seasons. Then, one morning, you would wake up to find a splash of scarlet and gold on a fence post, a poster. The greatest show on earth, or a miraculous medicine troupe was coming. For a people starved of visual stimulation, the arrival of a traveling show was like a hole being ripped in the fabric of reality, letting the light of 1,000 distant suns pour in. When the circus or the traveling show rolled into town, it didn't just provide an afternoon of entertainment, it provided months of mental food. People would pass the weeks leading up to the event in a state of high-voltage anticipation. They would discuss the woodcut illustrations on the posters with the intensity of scholars. The entertainment began the moment the dust from the wagons appeared on the horizon. The entire town would drop their tools, farmers left their plows, and blacksmiths let their fires go cold, just to watch the parade enter the square. To see an elephant or a camel in a world where the most exotic animal you'd ever seen was a particularly large bull was an experience that fundamentally shifted your understanding of the world. The show itself was a sensory overload designed to shatter the monotony. In an era of silence, the brass bands were deafening. In an era of stillness, the acrobats were a blur of impossible motion. People would sit on hard wooden benches, their eyes wide, absorbing every detail. They weren't just watching, they were recording it into their memories. Because there were no cameras, they had to pay a level of attention that we have largely lost. They had to memorize the glint of the sequins, the smell of the sawdust, and the fear in the pit of their stomach as a performer defied gravity. But the real magic happened after the show left. To pass the time in the long months that followed, the youth of the town would recreate the circus. Barns became theaters. Children would spend hours practicing tightrope walking on a fence rail or training the farm dog to do tricks. The content of the circus was stretched out, repurposed, and lived in for years. A single visit from a traveling troupe could fuel the imagination of a community for a decade, with stories of the strong man or the fire eater becoming local legends that were told and retold by the fire. Then there was the medicine show. Part theater, part scam, and part communal gathering, the medicine show was the 19th century version of an infomercial. A doctor with a silver tongue would stand on the back of a brightly painted wagon, flanked by musicians or exotic dancers. To pass the time, the crowd would listen to elaborate scripted pitches for elixirs of life that promised to cure everything from baldness to broken hearts. The entertainment was the performance of the salesman, the way he manipulated the crowd, the jokes he told, and the miracles he performed with plants. People knew deep down it was mostly theater, but they didn't care. They were paying for the story, the laughter, and the break from the crushing weight of the ordinary. These traveling shows taught humanity that time could be expanded. A single hour of wonder could outweigh 100 hours of boredom. By bringing the world to the doorstep of the isolated, these shows proved that the human mind has a desperate, unyielding hunger for the extraordinary. They didn't just pass the time, they gave people a reason to look at the horizon and wonder what else was out there, hidden in the great, quiet spaces beyond their home.
In the mid-1800s, a strange new obsession began to sweep through the parlors of America and Europe. It was a time of rapid scientific advancement, yet the more the physical world was mapped, the more people craved a connection to the invisible. Without the distraction of radio or film, the unknown became the ultimate interactive drama. This was the era of the spiritualist movement, where the boundary between the living and the dead became a stage for one of the most popular ways to pass an evening, the séance. For a Victorian family, a séance was more than a religious inquiry. It was a high-stakes psychological thriller.
Participants would gather around a heavy oak table, dim the lights, and join hands to form a human circuit. In the absolute darkness, the senses would become hyper-alert. Every creak of the house, every rustle of a curtain, and every change in temperature was interpreted as a signal from the other side. To pass the time, people didn't just sit in silence, they sat in anticipation. The entertainment was the communal creation of suspense. They were the writers, the actors, and the audience of their own supernatural mystery. The star of these evenings was the medium. These individuals were often masters of cold reading and stagecraft, but to the audience, they were conduits to another dimension. A medium might spend hours channeling a lost relative, using vocal changes and dramatic trances to captivate the room. To a modern audience, this might seem like a scam, but for those living in a world of high infant mortality and frequent loss, it was a deeply engaging emotional experience. It turned a quiet Tuesday night into a profound confrontation with eternity. It was the original immersive theater. As the movement grew, parlor tricks became a sophisticated way to defeat boredom. People began experimenting with automatic writing, holding a pen and letting it drift across paper to see what messages the subconscious or the spirits might produce. They played with early versions of the Ouija board, known as planchettes. These activities were fascinating because they were unpredictable. Unlike a book with a fixed ending, the spirit world offered infinite plot possibilities. You never knew what would be said or who would show up. This unpredictability is exactly what modern humans crave from social media notifications. But in the 1860s, it was sought in the flicker of a candle. Beyond the parlor, ghost hunting became a popular outdoor pastime. Groups of young people would spend their nights exploring haunted local landmarks, an old mill, a graveyard, or a deserted cabin. Without a screen to provide a safe scare, they sought out the real physical sensation of fear. They would pass the hours telling true local ghost stories, building up a collective dread until the snap of a dry twig would send them all running. This was leisure as adrenaline, a way to make the pulse race in a world that often felt too still. The spiritualist fever proved that when people are left with too much quiet, they will populate that quiet with ghosts. They turned the mystery of death into a participatory sport, proving that the human mind is never more entertained than when it is standing on the edge of the unexplained. They didn't just pass the time, they tried to reach across time itself, turning the great silence into a conversation with the infinite. In the mid-19th century, a new kind of hunting began to dominate the free time of the middle class. It didn't involve rifles or hounds, but rather magnifying glasses, small nets, and scrapbooks. As the Industrial Revolution pushed people into smog-filled cities, the natural world became the ultimate exotic destination. To pass the time, people turned into amateur scientists. They didn't just walk through the woods, they dissected them. This was the era of the natural history craze, where the act of collecting became a primary defense against the vacuum of boredom. Imagine a Sunday afternoon in 1870. Without a television to watch or a radio to listen to, a family might spend 4 hours in a local meadow. Their goal? To find a specific type of fern or a rare beetle. This was the hunt, and it was intensely engaging. People became obsessed with categorization. They would return home with pockets full of specimens, stones, dried leaves, or dead butterflies, and spend the evening meticulously labeling them. This was information consumption in its most physical form. They were building their own personal Wikipedias, one pressed flower at a time. For women, pteridania or fern fever became a genuine cultural phenomenon. Passing time meant searching for the most delicate fronds to press between the pages of heavy books. Once dried, These ferns were arranged into intricate artistic displays in scrapbooks. This required immense patience and a steady hand. It was a form of slow entertainment that rewarded deep observation. You had to understand the life cycle of the plant, the texture of the soil, and the patterns of the shade. By focusing on these tiny details, the hours of a quiet afternoon didn't feel empty, they felt full of discovery. The aquarium craze was another way people brought the entertainment of the wild into their parlors. Before the invention of the electric pump, keeping a balanced tank was a feat of engineering and constant attention. People would spend hours watching the slow movements of a snail or the breathing of a goldfish. This was the Victorian version of slow TV. They were fascinated by the miniature drama of an ecosystem. They would record the growth of their aquatic plants in journals, turning a hobby into a lifelong narrative of observation. It was a way to ground the mind in the slow, rhythmic pace of biology, a stark contrast to the clatter of the emerging industrial world. This obsession also fueled the rise of the cabinet of curiosities. To pass the time, individuals would curate their own private museums. They would trade specimens with neighbors or write to scientific pen pals in distant states to exchange a desert cactus for a coastal seashell. This created a global network of bored people who were connected by their shared curiosity. The content was the physical world itself. Every new object added to the cabinet was a story, a memory of a trip, a gift from a friend, or the result of a long day spent exploring a creek. By turning the environment into a giant puzzle to be solved and categorized, the Victorians ensured they were never truly alone. The great silence of nature was filled with Latin names, leaf patterns, and the silent language of the earth. They didn't just pass the time, they organized it. They proved that if you look closely enough at a single square inch of moss, you can find enough complexity to entertain the mind for a lifetime.
In the 21st century, we visit people through screens. A like or a short comment is the currency of our social interaction. But in the 19th century, especially during the height of the Victorian era, social interaction was a complex, high-stakes performance that filled the hours with a rigid yet fascinating drama. To pass the time, the middle and upper classes turned the simple act of dropping by into a choreographed sport known as the morning call. This wasn't just about friendship, it was about the meticulous maintenance of one's place in the world. Imagine a Tuesday afternoon in a growing American city like Philadelphia or Charleston. For a woman of status, the hours between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. were not free, they were calling hours. To pass this time, she would dress in a specific visiting costume, gather her engraved calling cards, and set out in a carriage or on foot. The entertainment here was the subtle navigation of etiquette. Each visit was timed with the precision of a Swiss watch. A formal call was expected to last exactly 15 to 30 minutes. Any shorter was an insult, any longer was a bore. The centerpiece of this ritual was the calling card. These small slips of paper were the social media profiles of their day. If the person you were visiting was not at home, a polite way of saying they weren't receiving guests, you would leave your card with a servant. To pass the time in the evenings, people would sit and analyze the silver tray in their foyer, looking at the cards left that day. A folded corner on a card wasn't a mistake, it was a code. A fold on the top right meant a personal visit. The top left meant congratulations. The bottom left meant a farewell. Decoding these cards and planning the return calls occupied the mind for hours, turning social life into a giant living puzzle. When a visitor was actually admitted, the performance moved to the parlor. Because there was no background music or television to fill the gaps, the conversation had to be an art form. People practiced the art of small talk as if it were a martial art. You had to be witty but not gossipy, informed but not overbearing. To pass the time, people would discuss the latest great exhibition, the sermons of a popular preacher, or the nuances of a new poem. This was a mental workout.
You had to keep the conversational ball in the air, ensuring there were no awkward silences. For a society that lived in a world of profound quiet, a silence in the parlor felt like a thunderclap. For the younger generation, these visits were the primary dating app. A young man calling on a young woman was a public event. They would sit in the parlor, often under the watchful eye of a chaperone, and pass the time by looking through a stereoscope, a device that made 2D photos look 3D. They would look at slides of the Alps or the pyramids of Egypt together. This shared visual experience provided a safe topic of conversation, allowing them to learn each other's temperaments through their reactions to the images. It was Netflix and chill, but with 100% more lace and significantly higher stakes. The art of the visit proved that humans will turn even the most basic social need into a complex game if given enough time. By surrounding the act of talking with 1,000 rules of dress, timing, and symbolism, the Victorians ensured that they were never truly bored. Their social lives were a full-time job, a theater where every gesture mattered and every word was a move on a grand, invisible chessboard. They didn't just hang out, they performed the masterpiece of their own civilization.
In the modern age, we suffer from information overload. We have the sum of human knowledge in our pockets, yet we often use it to scroll through mindless distractions. But in the 19th century, information was a rare and precious resource. For a farmer in rural Ohio or a merchant in a bustling New England port, data was the ultimate entertainment. To pass the time, they didn't just read for pleasure, they consumed facts with a hunger that we reserve for viral videos today. Their Google was a thick paper-bound book called the Almanac, and their Wikipedia was the Gazetteer. The Farmer's Almanac was perhaps the most important book in the American home after the Bible. It was a dense, multi-purpose tool that filled thousands of quiet hours. To pass a winter evening, a father might sit by the fire and study the astronomical tables for the coming year. This wasn't dry reading, it was a form of high-stakes prophecy. People would spend hours debating the weather forecasts printed months in advance, comparing the almanac's predictions with the behavior of local squirrels or the thickness of onion skins. The book provided a structural framework for the future, turning the passage of time into a series of predictable cosmic events. Beyond weather, the almanac was a variety show in print. It contained riddles, woodcut illustrations, cooking recipes, and moral anecdotes. People would read these sections over and over, memorizing the jokes to tell at the next barn raising. They would study the tide tables, even if they lived hundreds of miles from the sea, simply for the intellectual satisfaction of understanding the world's hidden rhythms. The almanac turned the great silence of a lonely farmhouse into an educational seminar. It made the individual feel like a scientist in their own backyard. Then there was the Gazetteer, the ultimate travel vlog for people who would never leave their county. A gazetteer was a geographical dictionary that described every known town, river, mountain, and kingdom on Earth. To pass the time, a young person would open the gazetteer to a random page and travel in their mind. They would read about the population of Zanzibar, the exports of Brazil, or the height of the peaks in the Himalayas. Without photos or videos, they had to build these worlds using the dry statistics provided. Population, 40,000. Principal export, coffee. Climate, tropical. These weren't just facts, they were the seeds of daydreams. For the more scientifically minded, the encyclopedia was a source of endless fascination. In an era where you couldn't look it up instantly, owning a single volume of an encyclopedia made you the local authority on everything from acoustics to botany. People would spend their Sunday afternoons reading about the internal mechanics of a steam engine or the anatomy of a honeybee. This deep diving into a single topic was a primary way to defeat boredom.
They didn't have notifications to break their concentration, so they could spend 4 hours mastering the history of the Roman Empire or the chemistry of soap making. This consumption of data created a society of polymaths, people who knew a little bit about everything. Because information was hard to come by, it was cherished. Every fact was a treasure to be polished and shared at the general store. They proved that the human mind doesn't need entertainment to be happy. It needs input. By turning the world into a giant list of facts and figures, they turned the act of waiting into an act of learning. They lived in a world where data wasn't something that tracked you. It was something that set your imagination free.
In a modern household, if there's a lull in conversation, someone inevitably pulls out a smartphone. We outsource our mental stimulation to algorithms designed to keep us scrolling. But in the 19th century parlor or the frontier campfire, a lull in conversation was an invitation to a battle of wits. To pass the time, people engaged in a form of verbal gymnastics that we have largely forgotten, the art of the riddle and the conundrum. This wasn't just child's play. It was a sophisticated, competitive, and often hilarious intellectual duel that could occupy an entire evening. The conundrum was the 1800s equivalent of a viral meme. Unlike a simple riddle, a conundrum usually involved a pun or a play on words. For example, why is a person who has too many secrets like a clock? Answer, because they are always keeping time, told in secret, but eventually strike. While it may seem dad joke adjacent today, in a world without recorded comedy, the person who could deliver these with the best timing was the life of the party. People would spend hours memorizing joke books or books of 1,000 conundrums just to have a fresh supply of mental ammunition for the next social gathering. This practice served a vital psychological purpose. It turned boredom into a collaborative game. When a riddle was posed, the room didn't just wait for the answer, they debated it. They would offer increasingly absurd or clever solutions, turning a single question into a 2-hour improvisational comedy set. This required everyone to be on. You couldn't just sit back and watch. You had to listen, analyze, and attempt to outthink your neighbor. It was a mental sparring match that kept the brain sharp and the social energy high, even when the only light came from a single flickering ember. For the more academically inclined, the paradox and the logic puzzle were the entertainment of choice. Men and women would sit for hours attempting to solve the farmer's crossing, how to get a wolf, a goat, and a cabbage across a river, or complex mathematical sequences. Because there were no calculators or digital hints, the struggle was the point. The entertainment was the feeling of the mental gears grinding. Solving a particularly difficult puzzle provided a dopamine hit far more satisfying than a social media notification because it was the result of sustained, concentrated effort. Then there was the acrostic and the charade. An acrostic was a poem where the first letter of each line spelled out a word. To pass a quiet afternoon, a suitor might spend 4 hours writing an acrostic for a young woman, hiding her name within the verses. It was a puzzle wrapped in a romance. Charades, meanwhile, were far more physical and chaotic than the version we play today. They were acting charades, where the players would perform entire miniature plays to represent a single word or syllable. A parlor would be transformed into a stage, with people using curtains for capes and umbrellas for swords. This era of mental puzzles proved that the human brain is a machine that hates to be idle. If it isn't given a problem to solve, it will invent one. By turning language and logic into a playground, our ancestors ensured that the great silence was always filled with the sound of laughter and the aha of a solved mystery. They didn't need content creators because they were the creators. Every riddle was a bridge.
Every conundrum was a challenge, and every evening spent in an intellectual duel was a victory over the vacuum of time.
Long before the first flicker of a motion picture or the glow of a television screen, there was a device that seemed to possess the power of true sorcery: the magic lantern. In the late 19th century, the arrival of a lanternist in a small town was the Victorian equivalent of a Hollywood premiere. This was the first time humanity successfully harnessed light and glass to project larger-than-life images onto a wall, effectively killing the darkness and turning a silent room into a portal to another world. To pass the time, people didn't just look at pictures, they were transported by them. The magic lantern was a complex machine for its time, using a burning oil lamp or limelight, an intense light produced by heating a cylinder of lime, to project hand-painted glass slides. For an audience that had lived their entire lives seeing only static physical objects, these projected images felt dangerously real. To pass the evening, a community would gather in a church basement or a town hall. As the lights went out, the great silence was replaced by the hiss of the lantern and the gasps of the crowd. The entertainment was a precursor to the modern documentary and the horror movie. A typical show might begin with travelogues, vivid, colorful slides of the Egyptian pyramids, the icy peaks of the Alps, or the bustling streets of Tokyo. For the average person, who might never travel more than 50 miles from their birthplace, these weren't just images, they were proof that a vast, colorful world existed beyond their horizon. They would sit for hours, mesmerized, as the lanternist narrated the journey, providing the voiceover for this early form of cinema. But the real thrill came with the phantasmagoria. Using ingenious mechanical slides, where one piece of glass moved over another, the lanternist could create the illusion of movement. A skeleton might appear to grow larger and fly toward the audience, or a ship might be seen tossing on a stormy sea. This was high-octane visual drama. People would pass the time gripped by a collective shiver, their imaginations fueled by the flickering, spectral quality of the light. It was the birth of the special effect, and it turned the vacuum of a quiet night into a theater of the supernatural. For the wealthy, the toy lantern brought this magic into the home. To pass a rainy afternoon, children would gather in a darkened nursery to put on their own shows. This required a high level of creativity. They had to write scripts, perform the voices, and manage the delicate glass slides without breaking them. It was a participatory form of play that turned consuming content into creating an experience. They weren't just watching a show, they were the directors, the lighting technicians, and the narrators. The magic lantern proved that human beings have a deep-seated psychological need for shared visual experiences. Even in a world of silence, we crave the big picture. By using light to paint stories on the walls, our ancestors found a way to bridge the gap between their quiet, isolated reality and the infinite possibilities of the human imagination. They didn't just pass the time, they projected their dreams onto the dark, proving that even a simple candle and a piece of glass could defeat the boredom of 1,000 years. If you were to walk into an American parlor in the 1890s, you would likely find a small binocular-like device made of wood and velvet sitting on the coffee table. This was the stereoscope, and for the Victorian world, it was the ultimate high-tech escape. Long before the metaverse or VR headsets, the stereoscope provided the first true 3D visual experience. To pass the time, families would spend hours traveling the world from the comfort of their armchairs, losing themselves in a depth of field that felt so real it was often described as a form of mental transportation. The technology was deceptively simple but psychologically profound. It used two nearly identical photographs taken from slightly different angles, mounted side by side on a card.
When viewed through the lenses of the stereoscope, the brain merged the two images into one, creating a startling illusion of three-dimensional depth. For a people who had only ever seen flat 2D drawings or paintings, the first time they looked through a stereoscope was a jaw-dropping moment. It didn't just show you a picture of the Grand Canyon, it made you feel as though you were standing on the very edge of the precipice. To pass a quiet Sunday afternoon, a family might go through a set of stereograph cards. These weren't just random photos, they were curated journeys. You could buy a set of 50 cards that took you through the entire Holy Land, the ruins of Rome, or the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. This was the era's version of binge watching. A person would slide a card into the holder, adjust the focus, and stare at the image for 5 or 10 minutes, absorbing every tiny detail, the texture of the stones, the expression on a distant face, the way the light hit the water. Because the experience was so immersive, the real world of the quiet parlor seemed to vanish. The stereoscope also served as a vital tool for social bonding. As one person looked through the viewer, they would describe what they saw to the rest of the room. I can see the snow on the peaks of the Himalayas. There is a small cabin nestled in the valley below. This turned a solitary visual act into a communal storytelling session. It provoked questions and fueled long discussions about geography, history, and the future of technology. People passed the time by debating the reality of what they were seeing, wondering if the world truly looked as vast and magnificent as the cards suggested. Beyond travel, the stereoscope was used for narrative sets, a series of photos that told a story, often a comedy or a melodrama. You might follow the adventures of a clumsy suitor or the history of a mischievous child through 12 consecutive cards. These were the ancestors of the comic strip and the television sitcom. To pass the time, families would watch these stories unfold, laughing at the physical comedy captured in the frozen 3D frames. The brilliance of the stereoscope was that it provided a window out of the isolation of the home. In an age where travel was slow, expensive, and dangerous, the stereoscope brought the world to the doorstep. It proved that the human mind craves presence, the feeling of being somewhere else. By conquering the flat surface of the photograph, our ancestors found a way to expand their horizons without moving an inch. They didn't just pass the time, they escaped it, proving that even in the 19th century, we were already looking for a way to step inside our dreams.
In the modern world, we often view a backyard as a place for a quick barbecue or a spot for the dog to run. But in the 19th century, the garden was a sophisticated outdoor parlor, a curated stage where people passed thousands of hours engaging in the slow, meticulous art of landscape architecture. For the Victorian middle class, gardening wasn't just a chore. It was a primary form of entertainment that combined physical exercise, scientific inquiry, and artistic expression. To pass the time, they didn't just plant flowers, they sculpted the earth into a reflection of their own moral and social aspirations. Imagine a Saturday morning in the 1880s. Without the hum of a lawnmower or the distraction of a radio, the garden was a place of profound, rhythmic quiet. A family might spend an entire day engaged in bedding out, the practice of planting thousands of colorful annuals in intricate geometric patterns. This was leisure as a jigsaw puzzle. They would use vibrant flowers like geraniums, lobelias, and marigolds to create carpet bedding that looked like an oriental rug made of living petals. This required immense planning and patience. They would sit on the grass for hours, meticulously spacing each plant to ensure the pattern was perfect. This was a meditative way to defeat boredom, turning the passage of time into a slow-motion explosion of color. The garden also served as a theater for the promenade. To pass the time in the late afternoon, people would walk the paths of their gardens, stopping to admire specific specimens or architectural features.
Gardens were designed with vistas and surprises, a hidden bench behind a weeping willow, a miniature rockery filled with alpine plants, or a sundial that acted as a silent reminder of the day's progression. This was entertainment by observation. You didn't just walk, you noticed. You noticed the way the light hit the foxgloves, the scent of the evening primrose, and the architectural precision of a well-trimmed boxwood hedge. For those with a scientific bent, the garden was a living laboratory. People passed the time by experimenting with hybridization, the art of crossbreeding plants to create new colors or scents. This was high-level intellectual entertainment. A gardener might spend years trying to produce a perfectly black tulip or a more fragrant rose. They kept detailed journals of their successes and failures, turning their backyard into a field of research. This scientific leisure provided a sense of purpose that made the long hours of the growing season feel like a grand, unfolding experiment. The garden was also the site of the lawn game, the original social network. To pass a summer evening, friends would gather for a game of croquet. Croquet was the perfect Victorian entertainment because it was gentle enough to be played in formal attire, but cutthroat enough to provide genuine drama. The click of the wooden mallets and the strategic positioning of the balls provided a rhythmic, low-stakes tension. It was a way to socialize without the intensity of the parlor, allowing for conversation to flow as naturally as the breeze. Perhaps the most magical aspect of the Victorian garden was the summer house, or the gazebo. This was a small, open-air structure where one could sit to read, write letters, or simply watch the clouds. To pass time in a gazebo was to participate in active stillness. You were protected from the sun, but immersed in the sounds of the birds and the wind. It was the ultimate antidote to the great silence of the interior house. By moving their lives outdoors, our ancestors proved that passing time is best done in partnership with nature. They didn't just build gardens, they built sanctuaries of the mind, proving that even the simplest patch of earth can be turned into a world of endless fascination.
As the 19th century drew to a close, the concept of leisure time underwent a radical transformation. For the first time in human history, a significant portion of the population had hours of the day that weren't dedicated to survival or labor. This vacuum led to the birth of the hobbyist. A hobby wasn't just a pastime, it was an obsession, a way to build an identity outside of one's profession. To pass the time, people began to collect, categorize, and preserve the world around them with a fervor that bordered on the religious. One of the most quiet yet world-consuming hobbies was philately, or stamp collecting. When the penny black, the world's first adhesive postage stamp, was issued in 1840, it inadvertently launched a global phenomenon. To pass a rainy evening, a person would sit with a magnifying glass and a pair of tweezers, meticulously arranging small scraps of paper into albums. This was the world in a binder. Each stamp represented a distant colony, a foreign monarch, or a far-off mountain range. Collectors would spend hours studying the perforations and watermarks of a stamp, finding deep intellectual satisfaction in the smallest details. It was a way to touch the entire globe without leaving a desk, turning the great silence of the home into a gateway to international travel. For those with a more adventurous and perhaps more macabre spirit, taxidermy became a shockingly popular home hobby. In an era fascinated by natural history, stuffing birds or small mammals was considered a noble pursuit for both men and women. To pass the time, a hobbyist would study the anatomy of a specimen, learning how to preserve the skin and pose the body in a way that looked lifelike. It was a marriage of science and sculpture. These stuffed animals weren't just decorations, they were trophies of a day spent in the woods, a physical record of time spent engaging with the wild. It provided a sense of mastery over nature,
turning the quiet hours of the night into a workshop of biological art. Then there was the autograph book. Long before followers or friends on social media, people passed the time by collecting the signatures and sentiments of everyone they met. An autograph book was a social map. You would pass your book to a friend who would spend an hour composing a poem, drawing a small sketch, or writing a heartfelt piece of advice on a single page. Reading through these books on a lonely afternoon was a way to relive social connections. It was a tangible, ink and paper version of a social media feed, filled with the content of one's own community. For the craft-oriented, fretwork or scroll sawing became a massive trend. Using a thin saw, hobbyists would spend weeks cutting intricate lace-like patterns out of thin wood to create brackets, clock cases, or picture frames. The entertainment was the rhythm of the saw and the high-stakes precision required. One wrong move could ruin 40 hours of work. This productive boredom resulted in the highly decorative gingerbread houses and furniture that we now associate with the Victorian era. These hobbies proved that when humans are given free time, we don't just want to rest, we want to build. Whether it was the silent study of a stamp or the delicate carving of a wooden shelf, these activities provided a ladder for the mind to climb. They turned the empty hours of the day into a quest for perfection, proving that the best way to pass the time is to become an expert in something, no matter how small or specific. They didn't just kill time, they immortalized it in their collections.
In an age before the podcast or the TED Talk, the most prestigious way to pass an evening was to sit in a drafty town hall and listen to a person talk for 2 hours. This was the era of the Lyceum and the Chautauqua movements, massive, organized circuits of public lectures that turned the pursuit of knowledge into a blockbuster event. To a modern person, the idea of paying to hear a lecture on the chemistry of a candle or the poetry of the Persians might sound like school, but for the 19th century soul, it was the ultimate mental escape. The Lyceum movement began as a way to democratize knowledge. In small towns across the American frontier and the industrial heartlands of Britain, the arrival of a guest speaker was a cultural earthquake. To pass the time in the weeks leading up to a lecture, the town would buzz with anticipation. People would read up on the speaker's books or the topic at hand, preparing their minds for the intellectual feast. When the night finally arrived, the local hall would be packed to the rafters. The entertainment was the power of the human voice. Without microphones, speakers had to be master orators. They used dramatic gestures, varied their pitch, and painted vivid word pictures to keep the audience enthralled. Famous figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Mark Twain, and Frederick Douglass traveled thousands of miles on bone-rattling trains to deliver these talks. To hear Emerson speak about self-reliance wasn't just an educational experience, it was a psychological recharging. People would walk home in the dark, their minds ablaze with new ideas, passing the rest of the night debating the speaker's points by the hearth. By the late 1800s, this evolved into the Chautauqua, the world's first intellectual summer camp. These were often held in giant tents near lakes or in scenic groves. Families would travel for days and camp out for a week or two just to attend a series of lectures, concerts, and plays. To pass the time at a Chautauqua was to undergo a total immersion in culture. You might spend your morning learning about the new science of electricity, your afternoon at a Shakespearean workshop, and your evening listening to a brass band. This movement proved that passing time could be a collective act of self-improvement. It wasn't about passive consumption, it was about the Chautauqua salute, thousands of people waving white handkerchiefs in silent approval of a powerful idea. It created a national conversation in a time before mass media. People in a tiny village in Iowa were thinking about the same philosophical problems as people in New York City,
all because of the traveling lecturer. The public lecture era taught humanity that the mind is the greatest theater of all. They didn't need CGI or surround sound, they only needed a brilliant idea and a voice to carry it. By dedicating their limited free time to the high mind.
As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the way people passed their time underwent a physical revolution. The great silence of the parlor was increasingly broken by the roar of the crowd. This was the era when local pastimes, often informal games played in cow pastures, were codified into the professional sports we recognize today. To pass the time, people didn't just watch athletes, they became part of a tribal identity, turning a Saturday afternoon into a high-stakes drama of community pride. In America, baseball became the national pastime precisely because it was the perfect way to measure the slow passage of a summer day. Before the pitch clock or the televised 3-hour limit, a baseball game lasted as long as it needed to. To pass the time, thousands of people would gather in wooden stands, eating peanuts and tracking every stat in paper scorebooks. The entertainment was in the tension of the pauses, the long stare down between the pitcher and the batter, the strategic shifting of the outfielders. It was a game of geometry and patience, mirroring the slow, deliberate pace of the life they lived outside the stadium. In Britain and across its empire, cricket served a similar purpose. A single match could last for days. To pass the time at a cricket match was to engage in a social marathon. Spectators would bring picnic hampers and tea sets, settling in for a long watch. The game wasn't just about the score, it was about the spirit of the play. People would spend hours discussing the line and length of a bowler or the condition of the pitch. It was a form of outdoor theater where the plot unfolded over the course of an entire weekend, allowing for deep conversation and communal relaxation. For the working classes in industrial cities, football or soccer became the ultimate weekly premiere. In the dark, soot-covered cities of the north of England, the Saturday afternoon match was the only splash of color and emotion in a grueling week of factory labor. To pass the time, men would walk miles to the ground, standing shoulder to shoulder in the terraces. The content here was the collective release of energy, the singing, the chanting, and the shared agony of a missed goal. It was the first time in history that thousands of people synchronized their emotions in real time, creating a human battery of excitement that powered them through the coming week. Even for those who didn't attend the games, following the scores became a primary way to pass the time. People would gather around the telegraph office or the local newspaper building, waiting for the returns to be posted in the window. The drama was delayed, which only heightened the anticipation. A man might spend his entire Saturday evening discussing a game he hadn't even seen, reconstructing the play by half-play through the brief reports in the evening edition. The rise of organized sports proved that humans have a biological need for vicarious struggle. When our own lives became safer and more sedentary, we looked to the athlete to provide the thrill of the hunt and the battle. By turning the field into a stage, our ancestors found a way to make the hours fly by, replacing the quiet meditation of the garden with the thundering pulse of the stadium. They didn't just watch a game, they lived it, proving that the best way to pass the time is to find something to cheer for.
For most of human history, free time was a luxury reserved for the aristocracy or a byproduct of the seasonal cycles of the farm. For the industrial worker of the early 1800s, life was a relentless cycle of work and sleep, with the only reprieve being Sunday, a day strictly reserved for church and solemn rest. But as the 19th century closed, a quiet revolution occurred, the birth of the weekend. To pass the time, the common person suddenly had a 48-hour window of autonomy, a development that changed the human psyche forever. The Saturday half-holiday was the first crack in the armor of the industrial grind.
Labor unions and social reformers argued that a person who worked 6 full days was a machine, while a person with a Saturday afternoon to themselves was a citizen. This new pocket of time created a massive demand for commercialized leisure. To pass the time on a Saturday afternoon, thousands of people flooded the new high streets. Shopping became a hobby rather than a necessity. The department store, with its bright lights, glass displays, and tea rooms, became a cathedral of the modern era, where one could spend hours simply looking at things they might never buy. With the arrival of the full Saturday and Sunday break, the excursion became the primary way to defeat the stagnation of the city. Railway companies began offering cheap Saturday returns to the seaside or the countryside. For a factory worker in London or Manchester, passing the time now meant seeing the ocean for the first time. The seaside resort was born, a place of piers, donkey rides, and Punch and Judy shows. This was a radical shift in human behavior. For the first time, people were traveling not for trade or war, but for the sheer purpose of being elsewhere. This new leisure time also led to the rise of the social club and the fraternal organization. To pass the time on a Friday or Saturday night, men would head to the Odd Fellows Hall or the Masonic Lodge, while women organized social circles or suffrage societies. These weren't just meetings, they were elaborate rituals with their own secret handshakes, costumes, and hierarchies. They provided a sense of belonging and extracurricular purpose. They turned the great silence of a life of labor into a noisy, busy schedule of community involvement. However, the weekend also brought a new kind of anxiety, the pressure to spend time wisely. People began to feel that their free time should be productive or recreational in a way that made them better for Monday morning. This was the beginning of the work hard, play hard mentality. They started buying bicycles, joining hiking clubs, and taking up amateur photography. The weekend turned time into a commodity that belonged to the individual, not the employer or the church. The invention of the weekend proved that when you give people time, they will fill it with life. It transformed the great silence from a burden into a playground. By carving out a space for rest and play, our ancestors proved that the quality of a life is measured not by how much one produces, but by how one passes the hours that are truly their own. They didn't just win a shorter work week, they won the right to be bored, to be busy, and to be themselves.
For thousands of years, music was a ghost. Once a song was sung or a violin bow was drawn, the sound vanished forever into the air, living on only in the imperfect memory of the listener. But in the final years of the 19th century, humanity achieved the impossible. We captured sound. The arrival of the phonograph and the player piano changed the way we pass time by decoupling entertainment from the need for a live performer. The phonograph, Thomas Edison's talking machine, was initially seen as a scientific curiosity, but it quickly became the ultimate parlor trick. To pass the time, families would gather around a flaring brass horn to listen to a spinning wax cylinder. The sound was scratchy, thin, and ghostly, but to ears that had never heard a recorded voice, it was miraculous. For the first time, you could pass the time with a famous opera singer or a comedy troupe from across the ocean without them being in the room. This was the birth of passive consumption. You no longer had to play the piano to hear a melody, you only had to turn a crank. However, the transition wasn't immediate. For those who still wanted the feel of a live instrument but lacked the skill to play, the player piano, or pianola, became the heart of the home. This was a mechanical marvel that used long rolls of perforated paper to press the keys of a real piano. To pass an evening, a person would sit at the bench and pump the foot bellows, controlling the speed and volume, while the machine handled the complex fingerwork. The player piano was a bridge between the old world and the new. It turned passing time into a semi-active performance. You were conducting the music, choosing the roles, which ranged from ragtime to Chopin, and filling the house with the resonant, physical sound of a real piano.
It allowed families to have sing-alongs with professional-grade accompaniment, turning the quiet of the night into a rhythmic, mechanical concert. The psychological impact of these machines was profound. They began to shrink the world. A farmer in the Midwest could pass his evening listening to the same Sousa march that was being played in a ballroom in New York. It created a shared cultural soundtrack, but it also introduced a new kind of solitude. For the first time, a person could pass time alone with music. You didn't need a crowd or a band, you only needed a machine. This era proved that humanity has an insatiable desire to repeat beauty. We didn't just want to hear a song once, we wanted to own it, to store it on a shelf, and to summon it whenever the silence became too heavy. By turning sound into a physical object, a cylinder, a disc, or a paper roll, we turned the great silence into a library of echoes. We didn't just pass the time, we learned how to hit replay.
As the 20th century dawned, the great silence was finally and permanently shattered by the neon lights and mechanical clatter of the penny arcade. If the Lyceum was about deep thought and the stereoscope was about slow immersion, the arcade was about the quick hit. This was the birthplace of modern, snackable content, a way to pass the time in 5-minute increments of mechanical whimsy and visual voyeurism. For a penny or a nickel, a passerby could step out of the rain and into a forest of iron and glass machines. To pass the time in an arcade was to engage in a series of mini-games that tested your strength, your luck, or your nerves. You might grip the cold metal handles of an electricity tester, paying a penny to see how much of a vibrating shock you could endure before letting go. Or you might test your manliness on a lung tester or a punch bag machine. These weren't just games, they were mechanical mirrors that allowed people to measure themselves against their peers in an increasingly automated world. The most revolutionary device in the arcade was the kinetoscope, the peep show. Before there were movie theaters, there were these heavy wooden boxes with a magnifying eyepiece on top. To pass the time, you would lean over, drop in a coin, and watch a flickering 40-second loop of film. It might be a woman dancing, a man sneezing, or a brief clip of a boxing match. Unlike the communal experience of the magic lantern, the peep show was intensely private. You were alone in the dark with the image, your eyes pressed to the glass. This was the ancestor of the scrolling feed, short, visual, and designed to be consumed one after another until your pockets were empty of change. Then there was the mechanical fortune teller. Behind a pane of glass sat a wax figure, often a zoltan or a gypsy queen, that would whir to life when a coin was inserted. To pass the time, people would wait in suspense as the mechanical hand hovered over a deck of cards before a small printed slip of paper slid out of a slot. These fortunes provided a narrative for the day, a tiny spark of mystery that people would carry back to their jobs or homes. It turned a mundane Tuesday into a day of unexpected visitors or financial windfalls. The penny arcade proved that as life became faster, our entertainment had to follow suit. People were no longer content to sit for 3 hours in a lecture hall. They wanted a thrill that could fit into a lunch break or a wait for the trolley. The great silence was being filled with the dinging of bells, the whirring of gears, and the flicker of early celluloid. This era taught us that passing time could be a frantic sensory experience. By turning entertainment into a coin-operated commodity, the arcade paved the way for the video game, the cinema, and the smartphone. Our ancestors didn't just pass the time in the arcade, they learned how to spend it, proving that even a single penny could buy a doorway into a world where the quiet was finally a thing of the past. In the early 1920s, a miracle occurred that permanently altered the human relationship with space and time. For the first time, the great silence of the home was not just filled by a mechanical record or a ticking clock, but by a live, invisible presence. The radio was the first technology that allowed a person to pass the time with the rest of the world simultaneously.
It turned the isolated parlor into a global village, and it brought the human voice back to the center of the experience. The early days of radio were an era of DXing, the hobby of trying to tune in to the most distant stations possible. To pass the time on a Saturday night, a radio nut would sit in a darkened room wearing heavy, uncomfortable headphones, slowly turning a series of dials on a crystal set. The entertainment was the hunt itself. You would navigate through static and whistles until suddenly a faint voice from Pittsburgh or London would emerge from the noise. It felt like eavesdropping on the universe. People kept logs of every station they caught, turning the act of listening into a competitive sport. Once the technology stabilized, the radio variety show became the heart of communal life. To pass the time, families would arrange their chairs in a circle, not facing each other, but facing the wireless set. This was a strange psychological shift. They were staring at a wooden box, yet their minds were projecting vast scenes of adventure, comedy, and music. Because there was no image, the theater of the mind was required to do all the work. To pass an hour with a mystery program like The Shadow, listeners had to imagine the foggy streets, the menacing villains, and the hero's secret lair. This made radio an incredibly active form of passing time. It required a partnership between the broadcaster and the listener's imagination. Radio also introduced the concept of the live event. For the first time, you could pass the time by experiencing a presidential speech, a championship boxing match, or a New Year's Eve celebration as it happened. This created a new kind of social synchronization. Millions of people were laughing at the same joke at the exact same second. The great silence was replaced by a collective roar. It cured the loneliness of the rural farmhouse and the isolation of the city apartment. Furthermore, radio changed the rhythm of the day. Stations began broadcasting soap operas in the afternoons to help homemakers pass the time during chores. These serialized dramas turned the mundane tasks of ironing or cooking into a cliffhanger-filled experience. Time was no longer something to be gotten through, it was something to be shared with fictional friends. The birth of radio proved that the most powerful way to pass the time is through the human voice. It took the intimacy of the 19th century parlor visit and scaled it to the entire world. By filling the air with invisible stories and songs, we finally conquered the silence of our own homes. We didn't just pass the time anymore, we tuned into it. As we arrive at the mid-20th century, the great silence that had defined human existence for millennia was finally, and perhaps irrevocably, filled. The arrival of the television was the final piece of the puzzle. It combined the visual magic of the lantern, the 3D depth of the stereoscope, the quick hit of the arcade, and the live voice of the radio into a single glowing box in the corner of the room. To pass the time no longer required an act of will, a hobby, or a conversation. It simply required sitting down and turning a knob. The television changed the geometry of the home. For centuries, the fireplace or the dining table had been the center of the household, a place where people looked at each other. Now the furniture was rearranged to face the screen. The theater of the mind that radio had cultivated was replaced by a theater of the eye. To pass the time, we stopped being the creators of our own entertainment and became the consumers of someone else's. The slow, rhythmic hobbies of the Victorian era, the fern pressing, the whittling, the letter writing, began to fade into the background. But what did we lose when we killed the silence? Our ancestors passed their time by engaging deeply with their surroundings. Because they had so little content, they made the most of every scrap of information and every social interaction. They developed high-resolution attention. When you only have one book, you read it 10 times. When you only see one traveling circus a year, you memorize the color of the elephant's blanket. When you sit in a silent room for 4 hours, you learn the topography of your own mind. Today, we live in a world where boredom is considered a problem to be solved instantly by a smartphone. We have traded the great silence for a great noise. We no longer have to wait for the almanac to tell us the weather or for a letter to tell us our friend is safe. But in this instant world, we often find that time passes faster and feels thinner. We scroll through 1,000 images and remember none of them. Our ancestors looked at one stereoscope card for 20 minutes and remembered it for a lifetime. The legacy of the great silence is a reminder that the human spirit is remarkably resilient and creative when left alone. To pass the time is not just to kill it, it is to inhabit it. Whether it was through a riddle, a garden, a public execution, or a magic lantern show, our ancestors proved that the mind is a machine designed to find meaning in the quiet. They turned nothing to do into everything to imagine. As we look toward the future, to AI, virtual reality, and beyond, perhaps the most revolutionary thing we can do is to occasionally reclaim a piece of that silence, to sit in a room without a screen, to look closely at a single leaf, or to engage in a long, wandering conversation without checking the time. By understanding how they pass the time, we might just learn how to truly live in our own.
Imagine a world with no music, no movies, no weekends, and no hobbies. You wake up on a cold stone floor, and your only goal for the next 16 hours is to find something, anything that won't kill you when you eat it. Today, we think of boredom as a problem to be solved. For our ancestors, boredom was a luxury they couldn't afford. This is the story of how humanity survived a world with absolutely no fun at all. For the modern American, the concept of fun is often tied to consumption, watching a show, playing a game, or grabbing a burger. But for the earliest humans, life was governed by a brutal, invisible ledger, the caloric debt. Every single movement had a price tag. To walk a mile cost a certain amount of energy. To climb a tree cost more. If you spent more energy looking for food than the food itself provided, you were dying. In this high-stakes mathematical survival game, there was no room for leisure. Leisure was a waste of precious fuel. The environment of the Pleistocene era was not a playground. It was a silent, predatory machine. There were no designated play areas or downtime. When the sun rose, the hunt began. But it wasn't the thrill-seeking sport we imagine today. It was a grueling, terrifying slog through dense brush and jagged terrain. If an early human felt a spark of curiosity to explore a cave just for the sake of seeing what was inside, that curiosity could be a death sentence. That cave might hold a short-faced bear, or it might simply lead nowhere, wasting the calories they had spent all morning gathering from bitter tubers and handfuls of insects. Entertainment requires a surplus. It requires the brain to have a moment of safety where it can stop scanning the horizon for predators. But for the early hunter-gatherer, the horizon was never empty. Their fun was the absence of pain. A good day wasn't a day where something exciting happened. A good day was a day where nothing happened. No one broke a leg, which was a death sentence. No one was snatched by a big cat in the tall grass. No one ate the wrong berry and spent their final hours in agony. Safety was the only reward, and it was fleeting one. Even the social structures were stripped of what we would call fun. While we imagine ancient tribes sitting around a fire telling jokes, the reality was likely much more utilitarian. Communication was a tool for coordination, not comedy. Information was passed down because it was vital: where the water was, which plants were poisonous, and how to track a wounded animal. There were no fictional stories because there was no time for things that weren't real.
The boredom we fear today was actually the ultimate goal for them, the rare, quiet moment when the stomach was full and the predators were at bay. But even then, the mind couldn't wander. It had to prepare for the next hunt. When we look back at this era, we see a species that lived in a state of constant, high-alert labor. They didn't have jobs because their entire existence was the job. There was no distinction between work and life. To live was to work. The idea of doing something just because would have been a foreign, perhaps even nonsensical concept. They were biological machines designed for one thing: persistence. In this chapter of human history, the sun was a clock, the wind was a warning, and the silence was a gift. But fun was nowhere to be found.
The dawn of agriculture is often portrayed as a monumental leap forward for humanity, a leveling up that brought stability and civilization. But for the individual human living through it, the transition from hunting to farming was the death of freedom. If the hunter-gatherer's life was a high-stakes gamble, the early farmer's life was a life sentence of back-breaking, repetitive toil. This era introduced a new kind of misery, the monotony of the work week, except the week never ended, and the work was performed under the scorching sun for 12 hours a day. When humans settled down to plant wheat, barley, and rice, they unwittingly entered into a contract with the land. They were no longer free to roam the landscape in search of variety. They were now tethered to a few acres of dirt. For a U.S. audience used to the concept of vacation or even a change of scenery, the reality of early farming is claustrophobic. These people spent their entire lives looking at the same patch of soil, performing the same rhythmic motions. The sheer physical toll was devastating. Skeletal remains from this period show a massive spike in repetitive motion injuries, slipped discs, and stunted growth. They weren't living the rural dream. They were being ground down by the very grain they tried to grow. In this new world, fun wasn't just absent, it was a threat to survival. In a foraging society, if one area was dry, you moved. In an agricultural society, if the rain didn't fall, you stayed and watched your family starve. This created a psychological pressure cooker. Every waking moment was spent weeding, hauling water in heavy clay pots, or warding off pests. The leisure of the hunter was replaced by the anxiety of the peasant. There was no Saturday night to look forward to. There was only the harvest. And the harvest was not a celebration. It was a desperate race against time and rot. If you didn't work until your hands bled, the winter would kill you. Dietary variety, which provides a natural sort of spice to life, also vanished. Instead of the hundreds of different plants and meats a hunter might consume, the early farmer lived on a bland, mushy monoculture of boiled grains. Imagine eating nothing but unsalted oatmeal for every meal, every day for 40 years. This wasn't just boring, it was nutritionally bankrupt. But there was no time to cook for pleasure or experiment with flavors. Food was purely fuel for more labor. The brain's reward centers, which crave novelty and excitement, were effectively starved. Furthermore, the rise of permanent settlements brought the first true sense of social debt. In a wandering tribe, if you didn't like someone, you could eventually move on. In a farming village, you were stuck with the same 50 people for life. Hierarchies began to form, and for the vast majority of people at the bottom, life became about serving the needs of the few at the top. You weren't just working to feed yourself, you were working to fill a granary that belonged to a chieftain or a priest. The psychological weight of being a cog in a survival machine eliminated the mental space required for play. By the end of this period, humans had traded the dangerous excitement of the wild for a safe, grinding boredom. They had become slaves to the seasons and the soil. The sun didn't represent the start of a new adventure. It was a cosmic whistleblower signaling the start of another day of lifting, bending, and digging. They had bread, but they had no reason to smile while eating it. The caloric debt of the past had been replaced by the physical and mental debt of the field.
leaving humanity in a state where the only thing more exhausting than the work was the soul-crushing lack of anything else to do.
As civilizations grew and empires rose and fell, the average human experience contracted into a small, dark, and terrifyingly silent box. For the common person living between the fall of Rome and the late Middle Ages, the world was not a global village. It was a 2-mile radius of mud and superstition. To a modern American, the most striking thing about this era wouldn't be the lack of technology, but the absolute sensory deprivation. There were no bright colors, no recorded sounds, and for 90% of the population, not a single written word they could understand. In this chapter of history, the lack of fun was enforced by a combination of isolation and an overwhelming fear of the invisible. Most people lived and died within sight of the church spire or the Lord's manor where they were born. There was no news from the outside world to provide entertainment or conversation. If a stranger arrived in the village, they weren't a source of interesting stories. They were a source of suspicion, or more likely, a carrier of a plague that could wipe out everyone you knew. The human mind, which is naturally wired for novelty and exploration, was forced to stagnate in a cycle of total predictability. The evenings were perhaps the most brutal. In a world before electricity, when the sun went down, the world simply disappeared. You couldn't read a book because you didn't know how, and even if you did, candles were an expensive luxury that few could afford to waste. You sat in the dark. The only sound was the wind or the heavy breathing of livestock kept inside the house for warmth and security. There was no nightlife. There was only the oppressive, heavy darkness and the wait for dawn. This wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a silence filled with the terror of the unknown, demons, spirits, and bandits that the mind conjured up to fill the void. Even the concept of identity was stripped of any recreational value. Today, we find fun in expressing ourselves through fashion, hobbies, or social media profiles. In the medieval world, you were your function. If your father was a blacksmith, you were a blacksmith. There was no finding yourself or pursuing a passion. The idea of pursuing happiness would have been seen as a form of mental illness or a sin. Joy was something reserved for the afterlife. The present world was merely a vale of tears, a testing ground where suffering was expected and even encouraged as a sign of piety. Art and music existed, but they weren't for you. They were for the stone walls of a cathedral or the halls of a castle you were never allowed to enter. If you heard music, it was usually a haunting, somber chant meant to remind you of your mortality, not to make you dance. The visual world was a palette of browns, grays, and deep greens. The vibrant neon lights or high-definition screens we take for granted would have been literally blinding to a person from this era. Their eyes were adjusted to a world of shadows, and their minds were adjusted to a life of total intellectual starvation. The lack of fun was effectively a form of social control. A population that is exhausted, frightened, and deprived of any mental stimulation is a population that is easy to manage. By keeping life focused entirely on the grim realities of bread, taxes, and the fear of hell, the powers of the time ensured that the common person never had the energy to imagine something better. Humanity was living in a mental cage, where the only entertainment was the occasional public execution, a grim reminder that as bad as your boring, grueling life was, it could always be much, much worse. By the 1800s, humanity entered a new kind of purgatory. The Industrial Revolution promised a world of progress, but for the average person, it simply moved the lack of fun from the mud of the fields into the soot of the city. This was the era where time was first stolen. In the agricultural world, you worked with the sun. In the industrial world, you worked by the clock. For the first time in history, human life was synchronized with the unyielding rhythmic pulse of a machine.
To a modern American, the most horrifying aspect of this era is the total loss of autonomy. In the factory, fun wasn't just absent, it was a fireable offense. Talking to a coworker, humming a tune, or looking out a window, if there even was one, was seen as a theft of the company's time. Workers were treated as biological attachments to the steam engines and looms. If a machine didn't stop to rest, neither did you. Shift work began, sometimes lasting 14 to 16 hours, meaning thousands of people lived their entire lives without seeing the sun for days at a time. They moved from a dark tenement to a dark factory and back again. This period introduced the urban desert. In the countryside, even in the worst of times, there was the occasional rustle of leaves or the sight of a bird. In the industrial city, nature was paved over. The air was a thick, yellowish smog of coal smoke, and the rivers were literal sewers. There was no green space for the working class. The sensory world became a repetitive nightmare of gray brick, black iron, and the deafening roar of pistons. This constant noise pollution created a state of chronic stress that made it impossible for the brain to relax or find joy. Even if you had a spare hour, your mind was too rattled by the vibrations of the factory to do anything but collapse. Childhood, as we understand it, also vanished. In the U.S. today, we view childhood as a time for play and discovery. In the 19th century, a 7-year-old was simply a worker small enough to crawl under a moving silk loom to clear a jam. These children didn't have toys, they had tools. They didn't have games, they had quotas. By the time they reached adulthood, the very capacity for fun had been pruned out of their brains by a decade of mind-numbing labor. They were a generation that had forgotten how to play. The only escape for many was the gin palace or the alehouse, but this wasn't fun in the way we think of it. It wasn't a social happy hour. It was a desperate chemical shutdown of a traumatized brain. People didn't drink to feel good. They drank to stop feeling the ache in their bones and the emptiness in their heads. It was a temporary anesthesia for a life that offered no other relief. The fun was the feeling of nothingness, because feeling nothing was better than feeling the reality of the slums. Humanity had successfully built a world of incredible production and wealth, but it had done so by turning its people into shadows. The machine cog didn't dream, didn't create, and didn't laugh. They were the first generation to live in a world of stuff without having a single moment to enjoy any of it. The machines were humming, the empires were expanding, but inside the human heart, the lights were completely out. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for those who had managed to escape the grinding poverty of the factory floor, a new kind of joylessness emerged. This was the era of the Victorian standard, where the absence of fun became a status symbol. To the rising middle class in the US and Europe, spontaneity was seen as a sign of low character. Life was no longer about survival in the mud, it was about the crushing weight of propriety. This period turned the home, once a place of rest, into a rigid theater of performance where every action was policed by 1,000 unwritten rules. Imagine a life where you could never truly relax, even in your own living room. For the Victorian family, fun was replaced by decorum. If you sat down, you had to sit perfectly upright. If you spoke, your topics were limited to polite subjects. The architecture of the home itself was designed to stifle joy. Rooms were dark, filled with heavy velvet drapes and clutter that was meant to be looked at but never touched. Children were famously told to be seen and not heard, treated more like fragile porcelain dolls than human beings with a need for play. The psychological toll of this constant self-censorship was immense. Every natural impulse to laugh loudly, to run, to express a raw emotion was met with a cold stare or a social reprimand. Socializing, which should have been a source of entertainment, became a minefield of anxiety. Calling hours and formal dinners were governed by strict etiquette manuals that were hundreds of pages long. Using the wrong fork or arriving 5 minutes too early wasn't just a mistake, it was a social death sentence. To a modern audience used to the casual comfort of a t-shirt and a text message, the effort required just to exist in a Victorian social circle is exhausting to contemplate. You weren't there to enjoy the company of others, you were there to demonstrate that you could follow the rules. It was a world where fun had been sterilized and replaced by duty. This era also saw the height of the rest cure and the pathologization of excitement. If a woman showed too much spirit or nervous energy, she was often diagnosed with hysteria and confined to a room with no stimulation, no books, no visitors, and no hobbies. The medical establishment of the time literally believed that too much mental activity or fun could break the human brain. They sought to create a society of calm, predictable, and utterly bored individuals. The vibrant, messy reality of human nature was being ironed out in favor of a stiff, starched version of humanity. Even the holidays, which we now associate with excess and joy, were somber affairs. Sundays were the grueling of all. In many communities, blue laws meant that everything was closed. You couldn't play sports, you couldn't travel, and in some places you weren't even supposed to whistle or go for a stroll. The day of rest was actually a day of enforced stagnation. You spent it in a stiff collar, listening to long fire and brimstone sermons, contemplating your own unworthiness. Humanity had reached a strange peak. We had finally built houses that were warm and safe, yet we filled them with a silence so heavy it felt like lead. We had conquered the wilderness, only to build a domestic cage of our own making. People were surrounded by fine china and expensive rugs, but they were starving for a single moment of genuine, unscripted laughter. The world was polished, polite, and perfectly miserable.
When we think of World War I, we think of the roar of cannons and the chaos of charges across no man's land. But for the millions of young men trapped in the mud of Europe, the war wasn't defined by action. It was defined by a soul-destroying, stagnant boredom. This was a new kind of no fun. It wasn't the survivalist hustle of the caveman or the repetitive toil of the farmer. It was the agonizing wait for a death that refused to arrive. Soldiers spent 90% of their time sitting in a hole in the ground, surrounded by filth, waiting for something, anything to happen. To a U.S. audience, the scale of this psychological waste is hard to grasp. Imagine being 19 years old and spending 6 months in a space no wider than a hallway. You aren't allowed to leave, you aren't allowed to stand up straight, and you have absolutely nothing to do. There were no radios, no podcasts, and no screens. Reading was difficult because the trenches were perpetually damp, turning books into mush. The only entertainment was the rhythmic sound of distant artillery or the sight of oversized rats scurrying over your boots. The human brain, designed for movement and purpose, began to eat itself in the silence. In this environment, even the smallest attempt at fun was stained by the grotesque. Men would gamble their rations on which rat would cross a line first, or give names to the lice living in their seams. These weren't hobbies, they were desperate attempts to keep the mind from snapping. The humor that did emerge was trench humor, grim, cynical, and obsessed with death. It wasn't the kind of fun that leaves you refreshed. It was a dark shield used to mask a total lack of hope. When you are living in a grave that hasn't been covered yet, joy feels like a foreign language you've forgotten how to speak. The sensory deprivation was accompanied by a total loss of privacy. You ate, slept, and relieved yourself in full view of dozens of other men who were just as miserable as you. There was no me time. The constant proximity to others, combined with the lack of any constructive activity, led to a state of mental paralysis. Many soldiers reported a feeling of heavy limbs, a physical manifestation of a mind that had simply given up on the idea of stimulation.
They became shells, staring at the mud walls for hours, their world reduced to the few feet of dirt in front of their faces. Letters from home were the only link to a world where fun still existed, but even those became a source of pain. Reading about a sister's wedding or a local baseball game felt like reading about a different planet. The contrast between the colorful, active life they used to lead and the gray, static nightmare of the trench was too much to bear. Many men stopped writing altogether, finding it easier to sink into the numbness of the trench than to remind themselves of what they were missing. The Great War was actually the Great Stagnation, a period where a whole generation of men learned that the opposite of fun isn't just work, it's the horrific silent wait for the end. When the soldiers finally returned home, they brought this silence with them. They were the lost generation, not just because so many had died, but because those who lived had forgotten how to be amused. They had been conditioned to believe that any moment of quiet was just a prelude to an explosion. For these men, the fun of the roaring 20s that followed wasn't a natural progression. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to outrun the silence of the trenches they had left behind.
By the 1930s, the no-fun era took on a gritty, suffocating texture. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic collapse, it was a psychological drought. In the United States, the vibrant energy of the 1920s didn't just fade, it was incinerated. For the average family, the quest for survival returned with a vengeance, but this time it was coupled with a crushing sense of shame. If the caveman felt no fun because he knew no better, the person living through the Depression felt no fun because they remembered exactly what they had lost. Imagine a landscape where the very air is hostile. In the Great Plains, the Dust Bowl turned the sky black and buried homes in fine, choking silt. To a U.S. audience, the image of home is one of comfort, but for millions during this time, home was a place where you taped newspapers over window cracks and still woke up with a layer of dirt on your teeth. There was no going out for a movie or grabbing a treat. Every penny was a life raft. When you're choosing between a loaf of bread and the kerosene needed to light a lamp for an hour, the lamp stays dark. Life became a series of grueling subtractions. The fun of this era was replaced by the line. People spent their lives in lines, bread lines, relief lines, lines for job interviews that didn't exist. This created a specific kind of mental exhaustion, the exhaustion of waiting for a miracle. For the American man of the 1930s, his identity was tied to his ability to provide. Without a job, he didn't just lose his income, he lost his right to enjoy himself. Even if a father found a discarded deck of cards, the guilt of playing a game while his children were hungry made the fun feel like a betrayal. Leisure became synonymous with laziness, and joy became a source of suspicion. Children of the Depression lived in a world of make-do. A toy was a hoop made from a rusted wagon wheel, or a doll fashioned from a corn husk. While we often romanticize this simple play today, at the time it was a reminder of a hollowed-out world. There was no novelty. You wore the same hand-me-down clothes until they were more patches than fabric. You ate the same thin potato soup until your stomach forgot the taste of meat. The sensory world was bleached of color. The vibrant advertisements of the previous decade were replaced by Hoovervilles, shanty towns made of scrap metal and cardboard. Even the radio, the one great escape of the era, was a double-edged sword. Families would huddle around a single set, desperate for a few minutes of comedy or music, but the battery was always dying, or the signal was weak. More importantly, the radio often brought the news of more bank failures or the looming threat of another war in Europe. The fun was a thin veil over a deep, dark pool of anxiety. You laughed at a joke on the air, but the moment the tube went dark, the silence of the empty cupboards returned. This was the era when the American dream felt like a cruel prank. People weren't just bored, they were defeated. The constant low-level hum of "how will we eat tomorrow" acted like white noise, drowning out any creative thought or playful impulse.
Humanity was back in a state of primitive survival, but with the added weight of modern awareness. They were trapped in a world where the dirt was everywhere, the money was nowhere, and the only thing more abundant than the dust was the hopelessness that sat at every dinner table.
In the 1950s, the no-fun world underwent a bizarre transformation. On the surface, it looked like the golden age of American leisure, the picket fences, the shiny cars, and the first television sets. But beneath the neon lights and the pastel-painted kitchens, there was a profound and sterile joylessness. This was the era of enforced fun, where happiness was treated as a civic duty. To a modern U.S. audience, the 1950s might look like a postcard, but for those living it, it was a period of high-definition anxiety. The fun was a mask, and the mask was suffocating. This chapter of human history was lived under the atomic shadow. For the first time, humanity wasn't just worried about starving or working too hard. They were worried about the literal end of the world. In American schools, children were taught duck and cover drills. Imagine the psychological toll on a child whose playtime was interrupted by a siren warning them to hide under a desk to survive a nuclear blast. When the fundamental premise of your life is that everything you love could be turned to ash in 30 minutes, fun feels hollow. It becomes a desperate performance rather than a genuine emotion. The new suburban lifestyle introduced a different kind of boredom, the boredom of the grid. Humans were moved out of the vibrant, chaotic cities and into identical houses on identical streets. The spontaneity of human interaction was replaced by the planned social. You didn't just run into a friend, you had a scheduled bridge game or a Tupperware party. Every aspect of leisure was regulated by social expectations. You had to have the right lawn, the right clothes, and the right smile. If you were unhappy, you didn't talk about it. You took a mother's little helper pill to numb the existential dread. The fun was curated, sterilized, and sold back to you in a box. The television, while seemingly a source of entertainment, actually acted as a massive silencer. Before the TV, people sat on porches and talked. Now they sat in darkened rooms, staring at a flickering screen in total silence. It was the birth of the couch potato, a state of passive consumption that looked like leisure but felt like paralysis. The content of early television was heavily censored and scrubbed of any real human conflict or grit. It was a fantasy world of perfect families that no one actually lived in. This created a comparative misery, the feeling that everyone else was having the fun you were told you should be having, but weren't. Furthermore, the Cold War created a culture of suspicion. Fun that was too unconventional or too bohemian was seen as potentially subversive or even un-American. If you liked the wrong kind of music or read the wrong books, you could be flagged as a communist sympathizer. This turned every hobby and every conversation into a potential trap. Spontaneity died because everyone was watching everyone else. You didn't want to stand out. You wanted to blend into the beige wallpaper of the era. By the end of this decade, humanity was living in a gilded cage. They had more leisure time than ever before, but they had no idea how to use it without feeling watched or worried. The vacuum of the 1950s was a sterile, climate-controlled vacuum. People had the gadgets, the appliances, and the backyard grills, but they were eating their hamburgers in the shadow of a mushroom cloud, wondering why the American dream felt so much like a long, quiet wait for a disaster that never came.
As the 20th century bled into the 21st, the no-fun world shifted from the physical to the ethereal. This was the era of the Great Disconnection. To a U.S. audience today, this might feel like the most relatable chapter because we are still living in its wake. We moved from a world where we had no time for fun to a world where we have infinite fun at our fingertips, yet we have never felt more drained. The joy was replaced by the scroll, a repetitive, numbing motion that mirrors the factory workers of the past, but instead of moving silk, we are moving data with our thumbs. The digital void began with the promise of total connectivity, but it resulted in a new kind of sensory isolation. In previous eras, even the most miserable humans had to interact with the physical world. They felt the wind, smelled the rain, and looked into the eyes of other people. In the digital age, these physical realities were traded for a glowing rectangle. Fun became a solitary act performed in a crowded room. You could sit in a coffee shop with 50 people, all of them having fun on their devices, yet the room would be as silent and cold as a tomb. The community, the very heartbeat of human joy, was digitized and diluted until it lost its flavor. In this chapter, the concept of leisure was hijacked by the attention economy. In the past, when you were done with work, you were done. In the digital void, work follows you into your bed, your bathroom, and your vacations. The boundary between living and logging vanished. We began to curate our lives for an invisible audience, turning every meal, every sunset, and every laugh into a post. This killed the actual experience of the moment. You weren't enjoying the concert, you were recording it. You weren't eating the food, you were lighting it for a photo. The fun became a performance for people you don't even like, leaving the actual human behind the screen feeling empty and hollow. The sheer volume of content created a psychological state known as decision paralysis. For the first time in history, we had too much to choose from. A person in 1950 had 3 TV channels. A person in the digital void has millions of videos, movies, and games. Instead of having fun, we spend our precious free time browsing. We spend 45 minutes looking for a movie, only to realize we are too tired to watch it. This isn't relaxation, it's a cognitive tax. The brain is overstimulated but undernourished. We are consuming junk food for the soul. Short-form clips that give us a hit of dopamine but leave us feeling more agitated than before we started. Even our hobbies were gamified and turned into grinds. Playing a video game used to be about play. Now it's often about leveling up or completing daily tasks that feel suspiciously like a second job. We turned our downtime into an optimization problem. We listen to podcasts at 2x speed to save time. We track our steps, our sleep, and our calories with obsessive precision. We have turned the act of existing into a spreadsheet. The no-fun world didn't disappear, it just rebranded itself as productivity. Humanity had finally reached the pinnacle of technological advancement. We had solved the problems of the caveman and the farmer. We had more fun available to us than a Roman emperor could dream of. And yet we found ourselves sitting in the blue light of our bedrooms, scrolling through endless feeds of strangers, feeling a deep, quiet ache. We were more connected than ever, but we had forgotten how to play, how to talk, and how to just be. The void was full, but the humans were empty.
As we look toward the horizon of the future, we see the final evolution of the no-fun world. We are entering an era where the struggle for survival is being replaced by the struggle for meaning. In the coming decades, artificial intelligence and automation promise to do for our minds what the steam engine did for our muscles. We are moving toward a world where work as we know it might become optional. To a U.S. audience, this sounds like a utopia, the ultimate victory over the grueling history we've just traveled. But there is a final hidden trap. If a machine does everything for you, what is left for the human to actually do? The last human faces a crisis that would have been incomprehensible to the caveman or the factory worker. For thousands of years, our fun was earned through the relief of finishing a hard task. The dopamine hit came from the contrast between the struggle and the reward. In a future of total convenience, that contrast disappears.
If you can generate a movie, a song, or a game instantly with a voice command, the value of that entertainment drops to zero. When everything is fun, nothing is fun. We are at risk of becoming a species of passive observers, floating in a sea of synthetic joy that requires no effort and yields no satisfaction. In this final chapter, the lack of fun comes from the death of challenge. Human beings are biologically wired to solve problems. We find genuine joy in the flow state, the moment when our skills are perfectly matched against a difficult obstacle. By removing all obstacles, we are accidentally removing the capacity for deep happiness. The future no-fun world isn't a world of mud or soot. It's a world of silk and screens, where the human spirit begins to atrophy from a lack of resistance. We are building a world that is perfectly comfortable, but perfectly meaningless. The last human will have to make a choice. Do we continue to sink into the digital ether, or do we intentionally reclaim the analog discomforts that made us human in the first place? We are already seeing the first signs of this rebellion. People are turning away from the infinite scroll to bake bread by hand, to hike through rain, to write with pens on paper, and to gather around physical fires. They're realizing that fun isn't something you consume, it's something you do. It is a participation sport. The no-fun era of the future will be defined by those who choose the easy path of the algorithm over the difficult path of the lived experience. Ultimately, the story of human survival is the story of a species that refused to just exist. We didn't just want to eat, we wanted to feast. We didn't just want to communicate, we wanted to tell stories. The history of how humans lived with no fun at all is a reminder that we are built for more than just staying alive. We are built for the thrill of the hunt, the pride of the harvest, and the warmth of the community. As we step into an uncertain future, the greatest danger isn't that we will run out of resources, but that we will run out of reasons to laugh. The journey from the caloric debt of the Pleistocene to the digital void of the 21st century has been a long, often joyless slog. But in every era, even the darkest ones, the human spirit managed to find a way to flicker. The lesson of history is clear. Survival is not enough. To be truly human, we must fight for the right to play, to fail, and to find joy in the struggle. The fun was never in the destination. It was in the resilience we showed along the way. Now, the question is, what will you do with your time?